Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting into the quiet world of the medieval scriptorium, a place where time moved at the pace of a quill scratching across parchment, where the only sounds were the gentle rustling of pages, the soft clearing of throats, and the distant toll of bells marking the hours of prayer. We're going to spend some time, quite a bit of time, actually, in the company of scribes, not the romanticized version you might imagine, but the reality of what it meant to spend your entire life bent over a writing desk, copying the same words over and over, day after day, year after year. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's step back about 700 years, to a stone room lit by narrow windows, where a young novice is just beginning to learn the craft that will consume the rest of his days. The arrival at the monastery. Our story begins, as so many did in medieval Europe, with a boy being delivered to a monastery. Let's call him Thomas, though his name doesn't really matter. He was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, though no one kept careful track of such things for children of common birth. His father was a farmer, his mother had died some years before, and there were too many mouths to feed at home. The monastery of St. Benedict, where Thomas arrived on a grey morning in the autumn of 1347, was not a particularly grand establishment. It sat in a valley in what is now southern England, though back then it was simply England, and the concept of southern was hardly something that occupied people's minds. The buildings were stone, because everything important was stone. They were cold, because stone is always cold, especially in England, especially in autumn. Thomas was handed over by his father to the abbot, a conversation that likely took no more than a few minutes. There might have been some discussion of the boy's future, perhaps a blessing, certainly no tears, at least not visible ones. This was simply how things were done. A younger son, not strong enough for heavy farm work, might find purpose in the service of God. And if that service meant a lifetime of copying manuscripts, well, that was God's will. The monastery itself was organized around a central courtyard, called a cloister. Around this cloister were arranged the various buildings. The church, of course, which was the heart of everything. The dormitory where the monks slept. The refectory where they ate. The chapter house where they met, and, crucially for our story, the scriptorium, where they worked. But Thomas wouldn't see the scriptorium for years yet. First, he had to learn to read. Learning letters in the song school. The process of becoming a scribe began, somewhat ironically, with learning to sing. Boys like Thomas were first sent to what was called the song school, where they learned to chant the liturgy. This served two purposes. First, it gave them something useful to do while they were still too young for serious study. Second, and more importantly, it taught them to recognize Latin words by sight and sound, even if they didn't yet understand what those words meant. Imagine Thomas, then, standing in a row with a dozen other boys, all of them shivering slightly in the cold stone church, all of them trying to match the notes being demonstrated by an elderly monk named Brother Anselm. Brother Anselm was patient, in the way that very old men who have done the same thing for 40 years can be patient. Which is to say, he was patient until he wasn't, at which point a wooden switch would appear and crack against the nearest palm or backside. The boys would chant the psalms. The same psalms, every day, following the cycle of the liturgical calendar. Domine, Dominus Noster, quam admirabile est nomen tuum. They didn't know what it meant. Not yet. They just knew that Domine was followed by Dominus, and that if you dragged out the U sound in tuum for exactly the right length of time, Brother Anselm wouldn't hit you. This went on for months, then years. The boys' voices changed, dropping from the clear treble of childhood to something rougher, but still they chanted. Some of them, the ones who showed no aptitude for letters, would eventually be sent to work in other parts of the monastery. The kitchens, the gardens, the stables. But Thomas, it turned out, had a good memory. He could remember long passages of text after hearing them only a few times. This was noted. When Thomas was about 12, he was moved from the song school to begin learning grammar. This was taught by a different monk, Brother Edmund, who was younger than Brother Anselm but somehow more frightening. Brother Edmund had studied at Oxford, which was mentioned often enough that everyone understood it to be important, though none of the boys had any real idea what Oxford was or where it might be located. Grammar, in this context, meant Latin grammar. It meant learning what all those words they had been chanting actually meant, It meant memorizing declensions and conjugations. It meant, most tediously of all, copying out basic texts over and over again on wax tablets. The wax tablets were reusable, which was important because parchment was far too expensive to waste on beginners. Each boy had a wooden frame about the size of a modern book, filled with a layer of dark wax. They would use a metal stylus to scratch letters into the wax, and when they needed to start over, they would warm the wax slightly and smooth it out with the flat end of the stylus. Thomas spent hours every day with his wax tablet. He would copy simple prayers, the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, then move on to more complex texts. He learned to form each letter properly, to space his words evenly, to keep his lines straight. When he made mistakes, and he made many mistakes, Brother Edmund would show him the correct way, often by guiding Thomas's hand with his own. This guidance was rarely gentle. The first real parchment. Thomas was 15 when he was first allowed to write on actual parchment. This was presented to him as a great privilege, which indeed it was. Parchment was expensive, made from animal skins, usually calf, sheep, or goat, that had been soaked, scraped, stretched, and treated until they became smooth writing surfaces. A single sheet might represent days of work by the parchment maker and cost more than a peasant family would spend on food in a week. The piece of parchment Thomas was given was small, perhaps the size of his hand, and it had a flaw, a thin spot where the scraping had gone slightly too deep. This made it unsuitable for any important work, but adequate for practice. He was to copy a short passage from the Book of Psalms, just a few lines. Simple, straightforward work. He prepared his ink, which he had been taught to make from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic. The ink was kept in a cow horn with a wooden plug, a simple but effective inkwell. He cut his quill, using a penknife to shape the nib just so, creating a sharp point with a small slit down the middle. This too had taken months to learn properly. Then he began to write. The quill made a scratching sound against the parchment, different from the sound it made on wax, more permanent. He dipped the quill frequently, careful not to let the ink drip. He formed each letter with deliberate care, the D of Domine, with its strong vertical stroke and rounded belly, the O, perfectly circular, the M, with its 3 even humps. It took him perhaps an hour to complete those few lines. When he was done, he sat back and looked at his work. It was adequate. The letters were properly formed, the spacing was mostly even, there were no major blots, but it lacked something. It lacked the effortless precision he had seen in the work of the senior scribes. His letters looked laboured, which of course they were. Each one had required conscious thought and effort. Brother Edmund examined the work without comment, then nodded once. This was high praise from Brother Edmund. The parchment was set aside to dry completely. Then it was carefully scraped clean and would be reused for another student. Nothing was wasted in the monastery, least of all parchment. Entering the scriptorium. Thomas was 17 when he was finally admitted to the scriptorium as a junior scribe. This transition was marked by no particular ceremony. One morning, after matins, Brother Edmund simply told him to follow Brother William to the scriptorium instead of returning to the lesson room. That was all. Thomas's education was considered complete enough. Now began his actual work. The scriptorium was a long room on the second floor of the monastery, positioned to catch the best natural light. It had windows along both sides. Real glass windows, not just shutters, which was a luxury found in few other rooms. The windows faced east and south, so the room received sunlight from morning until late afternoon, at least on days when there was sunlight to be had. Inside were perhaps 20 writing desks, called carrels, arranged in 2 rows. Each carrel was essentially a slanted wooden desk with a small bench, positioned to face the windows. There were shelves beneath each desk for storing materials, and hooks on the sides for hanging things like penknives and rulers. The desks were spaced far enough apart that a scribe could work without disturbing his neighbours, but close enough that space wasn't wasted. The room was quiet, not silent. Silence was impossible, with 20 men working, breathing, occasionally coughing or shifting position, but quiet. There was a rule against unnecessary speech in the scriptorium, and it was strictly enforced. If scribes needed to communicate, they used a system of hand signals. A finger drawn across the throat meant, "Make a correction." 2 fingers held up meant, "I need more ink." A hand pressed flat against the chest meant, I'm feeling unwell and need to step outside. Thomas was assigned a desk in the corner, where the light was poorest. This was to be expected. The best positions, near the centre windows, went to the most senior scribes, the ones working on the most important manuscripts. Thomas would have to earn his way to a better desk, if indeed he ever did. Some scribes spent their entire lives in the corners. His first assignment was simple. He was to copy out a psalter. A psalter was a book containing the Psalms, used by the monks for their daily prayers. The monastery went through psalters regularly, as they wore out from constant use, so there was always a need for new copies. This made it perfect work for a beginner. The text was familiar, the format was standardized, and if Thomas made mistakes, well, a slightly imperfect psalter was still usable. The daily routine. The rhythm of life in the scriptorium was dictated by the rhythm of monastic life, which in turn was dictated by the canonical hours, the set times for prayer that divided each day into segments. The monks rose before dawn for vigils, the first service of the day. After vigils came lauds, as the sun rose, then prime, at the first hour of daylight, then terce, at the third hour, then sext at noon, then none in the mid-afternoon, then vespers, as the sun set, finally compline before bed. Between these services, the monks had their assigned work. For Thomas and his fellow scribes, this meant time in the scriptorium, but not a continuous block of time. Instead, their work was constantly interrupted by the bells calling them to prayer. They would be writing, making good progress, getting into a rhythm, and then the bell would ring. They would have to carefully mark their place, make sure their ink was sealed so it wouldn't dry out, clean their quills, and file out to the church. This might seem inefficient, and by modern standards it certainly was. But efficiency was not the goal. The goal was to maintain the prayer schedule above all else, and to fit work into the spaces between prayers. If this meant that a manuscript that could theoretically be copied in 3 days of continuous work instead took 3 weeks of interrupted work, so be it. Thomas's typical day began, then, with vigils, held while it was still dark. After vigils, the monks would return to their dormitory for a brief rest, though Thomas often found it hard to fall back asleep. Then lauds at dawn, followed by a simple breakfast of bread and weak ale. Then to the scriptorium for the morning work period, from after prime until sext. This was considered the best time for detailed work, as the morning light was clearest and the scribes were most alert. At sext, they would stop for the midday meal, the main meal of the day. This was eaten in silence in the refectory, while one monk read aloud from a religious text. The food was simple: bread, pottage made from vegetables and grains, occasionally fish, never meat, except on feast days. The monks ate slowly, methodically, thinking about spiritual matters rather than the taste of their food, or at least they were supposed to be thinking about spiritual matters. After the meal came a brief period of rest, then none, then back to the scriptorium for the afternoon work period. The afternoon light was different from the morning light. Softer, warmer, but also more likely to shift as clouds passed over. By late afternoon, as vespers approached, the light would begin to fail, and work would become difficult. Detail work was generally avoided in the late afternoon. This was the time for simpler tasks, preparing parchment, mixing ink, cutting quills. After vespers came a light supper, then compline, then bed. The dormitory was a long room lined with narrow beds, each separated by a thin partition. The monks slept in their robes, as the dormitory was unheated and cold. In winter, it was common to wake with frost on the blankets. In summer, the stone kept the room mercifully cool. Thomas would lie in his bed, his hands aching from the day's work, his eyes tired from the strain of reading and writing in natural light, and he would think about the manuscript he was copying. He would visualize the next page, planning where each word would fall, calculating how much space he would need. And then, eventually, he would sleep, knowing that in a few hours the bell for vigils would ring and the whole cycle would begin again. The physical toll of scribal work. What the romantic vision of medieval scribes often misses is the sheer physical difficulty of the work. Thomas spent hours each day bent over his desk, his back curved, his neck craned forward, his right hand gripping the quill in a position that put strain on the small muscles of his fingers and wrist. His left hand was used to hold down the parchment and to steady his right hand when making particularly delicate strokes. Within months of beginning his work in the scriptorium, Thomas began to experience pain. His lower back would ache after long sessions at the desk. His right shoulder would tense up, creating a knot of muscle that never quite released. His fingers would cramp, especially his thumb and first two fingers, which bore the pressure of gripping the quill. This was normal. All the scribes experienced it. The older ones had developed various compensations. Some would stand and stretch between pages. Others would switch briefly to using their left hand for simple tasks, though left-handed writing was generally discouraged. Many had permanent calluses on their fingers, and some had developed a slight deformation of the hand where the quill had worn grooves into the flesh over years of use. The eyes were another concern. The work required intense focus on small details. Tiny letters, often abbreviated in complex ways, written in iron gall ink that was dark brown rather than truly black, on parchment that was off-white rather than pure white. All of this had to be read and reproduced in natural light that was never quite bright enough and was constantly changing as the sun moved or clouds passed. Thomas would find himself squinting, bringing his face closer and closer to the page as the afternoon wore on. Brother William, who worked at the next desk, was in his 50s and had been a scribe for 30 years. He could no longer read the smallest script and had been reassigned to copying books with larger letters. There were whispers that another scribe, Brother Jerome, had gone completely blind the previous year and had been moved to work in the garden, where he spent his days pulling weeds by feel. There was also the cold. In winter, the scriptorium was marginally warmer than the outside, but not by much. The body heat of 20 men and the weak sun through the windows provided some warmth, but it was never enough. The scribes worked with their hands exposed. Gloves would make it impossible to hold the quill properly, so their fingers would grow stiff and numb. The ink, too, was affected by the cold. It would thicken and become difficult to work with. Sometimes it would freeze entirely, requiring the scribe to warm it near his body before use. In the coldest weather, the scribes were allowed to have small braziers at their desks, metal pans containing hot coals. But these were dangerous. A spark could easily land on parchment and burn a hole through months of work. The heat would also cause the parchment to dry out and become brittle. So the braziers were used sparingly, and only by the most trusted scribes. Summer brought its own challenges. The heat would make the scribes drowsy, and sweat would drip from their foreheads onto the parchment, smudging the ink. Flies would buzz around the room, occasionally landing on wet ink and leaving tiny footprints across the page. The windows could be opened for ventilation, but this meant dealing with drafts that could blow parchment sheets off the desk or scatter loose pages. Understanding the text. Thomas's first psalter took him nearly 4 months to complete. This was considered good time for a beginner, though a master scribe might have completed it in 6 weeks. The psalter was to be a working copy, bound in simple leather and used in the church for daily prayers. This meant it didn't require elaborate decoration or gold leaf, just clear, readable text. But even this simple work required more skill than one might imagine. The Latin text of the Psalms was in the Vulgate version, translated by St. Jerome nearly 1,000 years earlier. Thomas had to copy this text exactly, without introducing errors. This was harder than it sounds. The exemplar, the manuscript he was copying from, was itself a copy, which had been copied from another copy, which had been copied from another copy, going back through generations of scribes. Each copying introduced the possibility of error. A word might be misspelled, a line might be skipped, an abbreviation might be expanded incorrectly. Thomas had to be alert for these potential errors. If he saw something that didn't make sense, he was supposed to check it against another manuscript if possible, or bring it to the attention of Brother William, who served as a kind of overseer for the junior scribes. But mostly, Thomas just had to trust that the exemplar was correct and reproduce it faithfully. The text was heavily abbreviated. This was standard practice, a way to save space on expensive parchment. Common words had standard abbreviations. Dominus might be written as DNS with a line over it. Christus might be abbreviated to XBES. Misericordia could be shortened to Mia with appropriate marks. Thomas had learned these abbreviations in his grammar lessons, hundreds of them, and now he had to recognize them instantly and reproduce them correctly. Occasionally, he would encounter an abbreviation he didn't recognize. This might be because it was unusual, or it might be because the exemplar scribe had made it up, using a personal shorthand that made sense to him but to no one else. When this happened, Thomas would have to puzzle it out from context, make his best guess, and hope he was right. If his work was ever checked, which it sometimes was, and an error was found, he would have to scrape the error away and rewrite it correctly. Too many errors, and he might be required to start the entire page over. The physical process of writing. The actual process of copying text might seem straightforward. You look at the exemplar, you write what you see. But it was governed by countless small decisions and required constant attention. First, there was the matter of layout. Each page had to be carefully planned before any writing began. Thomas would use a lead point, a thin rod of lead that left faint grey marks on the parchment, to draw guidelines for his text. These lines had to be perfectly horizontal and evenly spaced. He would use a straight edge, typically a long ruler made of wood or bone, to keep the lines straight. Some scribes had developed elaborate systems of pricking tiny holes in the parchment and connecting them to create guidelines, but Thomas used the simpler method of careful measuring and drawing. The spacing between lines was important. Too close, and the ascenders of one line might tangle with the descenders of the line above. Too far apart, and parchment was wasted. There were traditional standards for different types of books. A psalter for church use might have generously spaced lines for easy reading in dim light. A personal prayer book might have tighter spacing to save parchment. Thomas had to know these standards and apply them correctly. Once the guidelines were in place, the actual writing could begin. Thomas would dip his quill in the ink, not too deep, or ink would drip when he lifted it out. Not too shallow, or the quill would run dry after only a few letters. He learned to judge the exact right depth by feel. The quill would be held at an angle, around 30 to 45 degrees to the parchment. This angle was crucial. Too steep, and the ink wouldn't flow properly. Too shallow, and the strokes would be weak and irregular. The angle had to be maintained consistently throughout the writing, which required a steady hand and good muscle memory. Each letter was formed with a series of strokes. The quill would start at a specific point, move in a specific direction, lift off at a specific point, then return for the next stroke. For a capital A, for example, Thomas would make a diagonal stroke from upper left to lower right, then another from upper right to lower left, then a horizontal crossbar. Each stroke had to be the right length, the right angle, the right pressure. The pressure was particularly important. Press too hard, and the quill might catch on the parchment and spray ink. Press too lightly, and the stroke would be too faint. The pressure had to vary within a single letter, heavier on the downstrokes to create thick lines, lighter on the upstrokes to create thin lines. This contrast between thick and thin was what gave medieval script its characteristic appearance. Between words, Thomas would make a small space, not too large, as space was precious, but large enough for clarity. The spacing had to be consistent throughout the page. This was surprisingly difficult. The natural tendency was to let the spacing drift, becoming gradually larger or smaller as the hand tired or the mind wandered. Thomas had to constantly check himself, comparing the spacing of the current line to the lines above. Dealing with mistakes. Despite his best efforts, Thomas made mistakes. Everyone did. The question was how to deal with them. Small mistakes could sometimes be corrected without starting over. If a letter was slightly malformed, it might be possible to scrape away just that letter using a knife. The same penknife used to cut quills, and rewrite it. The parchment could withstand a certain amount of scraping, though it would become slightly rougher in that spot, and the rewritten letter would never quite match the rest. Larger mistakes required more drastic measures. If an entire word was wrong, the usual solution was to mark it with dots above and below, indicating that it should be ignored, and then write the correct word in the margin. If a line was skipped, a correction mark would be inserted into the text. A small symbol that meant the missing text is in the margin, and the missing line would be written in the margin with a corresponding mark to show where it belonged. Sometimes a mistake wasn't noticed until later, perhaps not until the entire manuscript was finished. In that case, if the mistake was serious enough, the only solution might be to carefully unbind the book, remove the page with the error, copy it again correctly, and rebind the book. This was a last resort, as unbinding and rebinding could damage the book and required the services of the monastery's bookbinder, who was always busy. The worst-case scenario was realizing that a mistake had been carried through multiple pages before being noticed. This could happen if the exemplar itself contained an error that was faithfully copied, or if Thomas misread something and then continued to misread it consistently. In such cases, there was nothing to do but start over. Multiple pages of work, representing days or weeks of effort, would have to be discarded or scraped clean and reused. Thomas learned to be meticulous about checking his work. At the end of each day, he would review what he had written, comparing it carefully to the exemplar. This was difficult, as his eyes were tired and the light was fading, but it was necessary. Better to catch an error immediately than to discover it weeks later. The monotony of repetition, what might not be immediately obvious to someone unfamiliar with scribal work, is just how repetitive it was. Thomas was copying the Psalms, which meant he was writing out the same prayers he had been chanting since childhood. He knew many of them by heart. He could probably have written out the entire Psalter from memory if asked, but he couldn't work from memory. He had to copy from the exemplar, letter by letter, word by word, exactly as it appeared. This meant reading words he knew by heart, as if seeing them for the first time, reproducing them with mechanical precision, making sure every abbreviation was copied correctly, every flourish was in the right place. The tedium of this was profound. Line after line, page after page, day after day. Dominus illuminatio mea, et salus mea, quem timbo? The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? He had chanted this psalm hundreds of times. He had now written it out letter by letter. And he would write it out many more times in his life, in many more psalters. Sometimes his mind would wander. This was dangerous, as a wandering mind led to errors. He might be copying the word Dominus but thinking about the last meal, or a pain in his back, or wondering whether it would rain. And his hand, working on autopilot, might write Dominus, but leave out a letter, or add an extra one, or slip into the next word too quickly. To combat this, Thomas tried to stay engaged with the text. He would think about the meaning of what he was writing, meditate on it as he formed each letter. Dominus illuminatio mea. The Lord is my light. What does that mean? How is the Lord like light? The theological implications could occupy his mind while his hand continued its mechanical work. But this too had dangers. Too much meditation on meaning, and the hand might make errors. The ideal state was a kind of balanced attention, aware of the meaning enough to stay engaged, but not so absorbed in theological reflection that the physical work suffered. This balance was difficult to achieve and harder to maintain. Some scribes, the very experienced ones, seemed to enter a sort of trance state while working. Their hands moved with mechanical precision while their minds were elsewhere. Perhaps in prayer, perhaps in memory, perhaps in nothing at all. Thomas aspired to this, but had not yet achieved it. He was still too conscious of each letter, each word, each line. Hierarchy and relationships. The scriptorium was not simply a room where men worked in parallel. It was a community with its own hierarchy, relationships, and unwritten rules. At the top was Brother Ambrose, the armarius or librarian of the monastery. He was responsible for the entire book collection, which meant not only the books in the library, but also those being used throughout the monastery and those being created in the scriptorium. Brother Ambrose decided which books would be copied, assigned scribes to specific projects, procured the necessary materials, and checked the finished work for quality. Brother Ambrose was in his 60s, a thin man with a face like weathered parchment and hands that trembled slightly with age. He had been a scribe himself for 40 years before being appointed armarius. He knew every manuscript in the library by heart, could identify the hand of different scribes at a glance, and could estimate to the day how long a particular copying project should take. He made his rounds of the scriptorium twice daily, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. He would move silently between the desks, looking over shoulders, occasionally nodding approval, occasionally frowning, and making a note on a wax tablet he carried. The scribes always knew when Brother Ambrose was near, even before seeing him. There was a quality to the silence that deepened when he was present. Below Brother Ambrose in the hierarchy were the master scribes, men like Brother William, who had proven their skill over many years and were trusted with the most important manuscripts. Brother William was 43, had been copying books since he was 16, and could produce text of astonishing precision and beauty. His letters were perfectly uniform, his spacing was immaculate, his pages looked as if they had been printed rather than handwritten. Brother William served as an informal teacher to the younger scribes. If Thomas had a question about technique, he would wait for a break in the work, then approach Brother William with the appropriate hand signal. Brother William would come to Thomas's desk, examine the problem, and demonstrate the solution without words, using gestures and examples. He was patient but exacting, and Thomas learned to value his approval as highly as he feared his disapproval. Then there were the journeyman scribes, men who had completed their basic training and could be trusted with standard copying work, but were not yet masters. There were perhaps a dozen of these in the scriptorium, ranging in age from early 20s to late 40s. Some would eventually become masters. Others had reached the limit of their ability and would remain journeymen for life, which was no shame. Competent scribes were always needed. Finally, there were the junior scribes like Thomas, still learning, still making too many errors, still being given the simplest tasks and the worst positions. There were usually 3 or 4 juniors at any given time, as boys came of age and were promoted or left the monastery. Communication and connection. The rule of silence in the scriptorium meant that relationships developed differently than they might have elsewhere. The scribes couldn't gossip during work or share stories or complain about their aches and pains. All communication had to be through gestures or outside of work hours, in brief and formal exchanges. Yet bonds formed nonetheless. Thomas found himself developing a strange kind of friendship with Martin, another junior scribe who had started a few months before Thomas. They never spoke during work, but they understood each other's gestures, could read frustration or satisfaction in the set of each other's shoulders, shared silent commiseration when Brother Ambrose frowned at their work. Outside the scriptorium, during meals or the brief recreation periods, they would sometimes talk. These conversations were stilted. All conversations in the monastery were stilted, as the monks were not encouraged to speak unnecessarily, but they were something. Martin would mention that he was struggling with a particular abbreviation, and Thomas would share what Brother William had shown him. Thomas would complain about the pain in his hand, and Martin would describe a stretching exercise another scribe had taught him. There was also a sense of shared purpose that created connection. All the scribes were working toward the same goal, preserving and propagating knowledge. Every manuscript they completed was a victory against the forces of entropy and ignorance. When one scribe finished a particularly challenging book, the others would acknowledge it with nods of respect. When someone made a serious error, there was collective sympathy, because everyone had been there. The older scribes remembered younger versions of themselves in the juniors. Brother William had once told Thomas, in a rare moment of personal conversation, that he saw something of himself in Thomas's careful, methodical approach. This had been said matter-of-factly, without sentiment, but Thomas treasured it as high praise. The rhythm of seasons in the scriptorium. The work of the scriptorium changed with the seasons, not just because of the light and temperature, but because of the liturgical calendar. In Advent, the weeks leading up to Christmas, there was a push to complete certain manuscripts that would be needed for the Christmas services. Graduals, books containing the sung parts of the Mass, were in particular demand. The scribes would work longer hours, starting earlier when the light was still dim and continuing into the evening by candlelight, which was normally forbidden due to the fire risk. Christmas itself was a break from work. For several days, the scriptorium was empty, as the monks devoted themselves entirely to prayer and celebration. When work resumed, it was often sluggish, as everyone was tired from the extended services and the rich food of the feast days. Lent brought a different rhythm. This was a time of fasting and penance, and the work in the scriptorium reflected this. The hours were long, the meals were sparse, and there was an expectation of heightened dedication. Some scribes took on extra projects as a form of penance. Others intensified their focus on perfection, treating each letter as an act of devotion. Easter was another major break, followed by a period of relief and renewal. The spring light was particularly good for detailed work, and there was often a surge of productivity. Thomas found that his best work was done in April and May, when the light was bright but not too harsh, the temperature was comfortable, and his spirits were lifted by the sense of the world coming back to life. Summer was challenging. The heat made concentration difficult, and the long days meant that work hours could be extended, but the quality of work often suffered. Many scribes found themselves making more errors in summer, their attention wandering, their hands growing sweaty and imprecise. Autumn was perhaps the best season for scribal work. The light was angled and golden. The temperature was cool enough to keep the scribes alert, but not so cold as to numb their fingers. And there was a sense of urgency as everyone knew that winter was coming and would bring its own challenges. Winter meant working by the weakest light, dealing with ink that wouldn't flow properly, and enduring cold that made every day a physical ordeal. But it also meant quieter, more meditative work. The whole world seemed to slow down in winter, and the scriptorium slowed with it. Types of books being copied. Thomas's first psalter was just the beginning. As he gained experience and proved his reliability, he was assigned other types of manuscripts to copy. There were gospel books, containing the 4 Gospels in Latin. These were used during Mass, carried in procession, kissed by the priest, and placed on the altar. Because of their liturgical importance, gospel books often received more elaborate decoration than other types of books. Thomas might be assigned to copy the text, while another scribe, one skilled in illumination, would add decorated initial letters and perhaps illustrations of the evangelists. There were Bibles, though complete Bibles were rare and expensive. More common were portions of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the historical books, the Psalms, the Prophets, the New Testament, bound as separate volumes. A complete Bible might be a project that occupied multiple scribes for a year or more. There were saints' lives, accounts of miracles and martyrdoms that were read aloud in the refectory during meals or in the chapter house during meetings. These were popular texts, frequently copied, and they offered more variety than liturgical books. The stories were dramatic. Saints confronting emperors, enduring tortures, performing miracles. And while Thomas had to maintain his neutral, careful copying style, he couldn't help but be engaged by the content. There were works of theology and philosophy. Augustine's City of God, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, commentaries on Scripture by various church fathers. These were complex texts, often with layers of meaning and extensive quotations from other sources. Copying them required not just technical skill but understanding, as errors in theological texts could propagate false doctrine. There were medical texts, herbal guides, astronomical tables, bestiaries describing real and mythical animals, chronicles of history. The monastery library aimed to be comprehensive, containing all knowledge worth preserving, and this meant copying a wide variety of texts. The problem of exemplars. One of the ongoing challenges in the scriptorium was the quality of the exemplars. Ideally, each text would be copied from a perfect original, free of errors and completely reliable. In reality, most exemplars were themselves copies, often several generations removed from any authoritative version. Over time, errors accumulated. A scribe would misread a word and copy it incorrectly. The next scribe, copying from that flawed manuscript, would reproduce the error. Sometimes someone would notice the error and correct it, but sometimes the correction itself would be wrong, creating a new error. Sometimes a scribe would try to improve the text, adding clarifications or changing archaic language to more modern forms, and these changes would then be incorporated into future copies. The result was that multiple versions of the same text might exist, each slightly different from the others. When Brother Ambrose assigned a copying project, he would choose the best exemplar available, but best was a relative term. Thomas learned to be alert for passages that seemed wrong or inconsistent, and to bring them to Brother William's attention. Sometimes Brother Ambrose would attempt to create a corrected version by comparing multiple exemplars. He would lay out 3 or 4 copies of the same text, identify where they differed, and try to determine which version was most likely to be correct. This was painstaking work, requiring deep knowledge of Latin, of the subject matter, and of the history of the text. The corrected version would then become the new exemplar for future copies. Special challenges, legal documents and charters. Not all of the scriptorium's work involved religious texts. The monastery also had legal and administrative needs, and these too required the services of scribes. Charters were formal legal documents that recorded grants of land, agreements between parties, or royal privileges. These had to be copied with absolute precision, as any error could invalidate the document or lead to legal disputes. The language was highly formulaic, full of standard phrases and legal terminology that had been used for centuries. Thomas was occasionally assigned to copy charters, though only after he had proven his reliability with religious texts. The work was tedious, even by scribal standards. The phrases were repetitive and the content was dry. Lists of properties, descriptions of boundaries, enumerations of rights and privileges, but the stakes were high. A charter might determine whether the monastery had the right to collect taxes from a particular village, or whether a piece of land belonged to the monastery or to a rival landowner. The format of charters was also important. They had specific layouts, with the opening phrase in larger letters, the main text in a standard script, and the witnesses' names listed at the bottom. Many charters ended with elaborate curse clauses, threatening divine punishment on anyone who violated the agreement. These clauses were often quite creative in their descriptions of the torments awaiting oath-breakers. When a charter was completed, it would be checked multiple times by different people. Brother Ambrose would review it, comparing every word to the exemplar. The abbot himself might review it, even though he was not a scribe. Sometimes the charter would be sent to a legal expert in a larger monastery or a cathedral to verify that it was properly composed. Only when everyone was satisfied would the charter be sealed and delivered. The concept of perfection. In the scriptorium, there was an ideal of perfection that governed all the work. A perfect manuscript would have text copied without any errors, with letters that were uniform and beautifully formed, with spacing that was mathematically precise, with decoration that enhanced rather than distracted from the text. This ideal was almost never achieved, but it was always the goal. The pursuit of perfection was understood as a form of prayer. Just as a monk sought to perfect his soul through discipline and devotion, so a scribe sought to perfect his manuscripts through skill and attention. Each letter was an offering to God. Each page was an act of worship. This meant that work in the scriptorium was never just technical. It was spiritual. When Thomas formed a letter, he was not just making a mark on parchment. He was participating in the divine act of creation. When he completed a manuscript, he was not just finishing a task. He was adding to the treasury of human knowledge and divine revelation. The flip side of this was that errors were not just mistakes. They were sins, or at least failures of devotion. A sloppy letter suggested a sloppy soul. A skipped line indicated wandering attention, which was a form of sloth. The scribes were encouraged to confess their errors to God, to do penance for their mistakes, to strive constantly for improvement. Some scribes became obsessed with perfection, spending hours on a single page, scraping and rewriting the same passage multiple times because it wasn't quite right. Brother Ambrose had to watch for this tendency and rein it in when necessary. Perfection was the goal, but the work also had to be completed. A manuscript that was 90% perfect and finished was better than a manuscript that was 99% perfect, but would take years to complete. Thomas navigated between these extremes. He wanted his work to be as good as possible, but he also understood the practical need to make progress. He learned to recognize when a page was good enough, even if it wasn't perfect. He learned to accept his limitations, to understand that he was still learning, that perfection would come with time and practice, if it came at all. The making of parchment. Thomas had little direct involvement in making parchment. That was the work of specialized craftsmen outside the monastery. But he learned about the process because understanding the material helped him work with it better. Parchment began with an animal skin, usually from a calf, sheep, or goat. The skin would be soaked in water for several days, to loosen the hair and flesh. Then it would be draped over a curved beam and scraped with a curved blade to remove the hair on one side and any remaining flesh on the other. This scraping had to be thorough but careful. Too much pressure, and the skin might be damaged or develop thin spots. After scraping, the skin would be stretched on a wooden frame and left to dry under tension. As it dried, it would be scraped again, this time with a specialized tool called a lunellum, which had a curved blade for removing any remaining imperfections. Chalk or lime might be applied to help dry the skin and make it whiter. The result was a thin, smooth, cream-colored sheet that could be written on both sides. Good parchment was a pleasure to work with. The quill glided across it smoothly, the ink sat on the surface without bleeding or spreading. Poor parchment was a constant frustration. It might be too rough, causing the quill to catch, or too thin, allowing ink to show through from the other side, or unevenly processed, with some areas smooth and others rough. The monastery purchased parchment from several sources. Some came from a craftsman in a nearby town. Some was made by lay brothers at the monastery who had been trained in the craft. The quality varied, and part of Brother Ambrose's job was to examine each batch of parchment and assign it appropriately. The best sheets went to important manuscripts. Lesser quality parchment was used for practice or for working copies that wouldn't be kept long. A single manuscript might require dozens of sheets of parchment. A large Bible could use the skins of 300 animals. This represented not just the cost of the skins themselves, but the labor of processing them, which could take weeks or months. It was no wonder that parchment was treasured, that every scrap was saved and reused when possible. Ink, the lifeblood of scribal work. The ink used in the scriptorium was primarily iron gall ink, made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic, with water added to achieve the right consistency. Oak galls were strange growths on oak trees, caused by wasp larvae. They were hard, round, about the size of a marble, and brown or grey in colour. When crushed and soaked in water, they released tannic acid. This acidic solution would then be mixed with iron salts, usually ferrous sulfate, which could be obtained by leaving iron nails in vinegar until they rusted. When the tannic acid met the iron salts, a chemical reaction occurred, producing a dark brown or black liquid. This was the basis of the ink. To this would be added gum arabic, a tree resin that helped the ink adhere to the parchment and prevented it from spreading. The proportions had to be just right. Too much gum, and the ink would be thick and sticky. Too little, and it would be thin and would feather on the parchment. The colour of iron gall ink was distinctive. When first applied, it was often a brownish colour, but it would darken over time as the iron oxidized further. A page that looked brown when freshly written might turn nearly black after a few days. This could make it difficult to judge the quality of writing immediately. What looked good when wet might look uneven when dry. Iron gall ink had both advantages and disadvantages. On the positive side, it was permanent. It wouldn't fade easily, and it was resistant to water. On the negative side, it was acidic, and over time this acid could eat through the parchment, creating brown stains or even holes where the ink had been. Many medieval manuscripts that survive today show this damage, with letters burned away by the very ink that created them. The monastery made its own ink, a task that fell to the junior scribes when they weren't copying. Thomas had spent many hours grinding oak galls with a mortar and pestle, mixing the powder with water, adding iron salts carefully measured from a balanced scale, stirring in gum arabic, testing the consistency on scraps of parchment. Each scribe had his preferred recipe, small variations in proportions or technique that produced ink with slightly different properties. Some liked their ink very dark and thick. Others preferred a thinner, more fluid ink. Thomas was still experimenting, trying to find the formula that worked best for his particular style and the current weather conditions, which affected how the ink behaved. Quills, from feather to pen. The primary writing instrument was the quill, made from the flight feathers of large birds, usually geese, sometimes swans. The feathers used were typically from the outer edge of the wing, as these were the largest and strongest. Preparing a quill for writing was a skill in itself. The feather would first be stripped of its veins, the soft, fluffy part, leaving just the hollow shaft or barrel. This barrel was where the ink would be stored during writing. The end of the barrel would be cut at an angle to create a nib, and a small slit would be cut down the centre of the nib. This slit was crucial. It allowed ink to flow down to the tip of the quill through capillary action. The shape of the nib determined the character of the writing. A broad nib created thick letters with strong contrasts between thick and thin strokes. A narrow nib produced more delicate, uniform lines. The angle of the cut affected how the quill held the ink and how it felt against the parchment. Getting this right required practice and a good penknife. The penknife was one of a scribe's most important tools. It had to be extremely sharp to make clean cuts in the quill without crushing the hollow shaft. Scribes would spend time each day sharpening their penknives on whetstones, testing the edge against their thumbnail, making sure it could slice through a quill with minimal pressure. A quill would last for days or weeks depending on how heavily it was used and how often it was recut. As the scribe worked, the nib would gradually wear down, becoming blunt or developing splits beyond the main slit. When this happened, the scribe would cut off the worn end and reshape the nib. This could be done several times before the quill became too short to use comfortably. At any given time, Thomas might have a dozen quills in various stages of use. Fresh quills ready to be cut, working quills in daily use, worn quills that were nearly finished. He would also have several penknives, as these too needed to be maintained and occasionally replaced. There was a particular pleasure in working with a perfectly prepared quill. It would hold just the right amount of ink, release it at just the right rate, and glide across the parchment with a satisfying whisper of sound. A poor quill, by contrast, would make writing a constant struggle. It might hold too much ink and blot, or too little and scratch, or split unexpectedly and ruin a letter. Other tools of the trade. Beyond parchment, ink, and quills, a scribe needed various other tools. There was the ruler, used for drawing guidelines and measuring margins. These were typically made of wood or bone, marked with measurements. Some were quite plain, just a straight edge. Others were more elaborate, with different measurement scales on different edges. There was the awl or pricking tool, used to make tiny holes in the parchment that could be connected to create guidelines. This method was more time-consuming than simply drawing lines with a lead point, but it was more precise, and the holes could guide the ruler if lines needed to be redrawn. There was the compass, used for drawing circles and curves, particularly in decorated initial letters. A simple compass was just 2 points connected by an adjustable arm, but some were quite sophisticated, with interchangeable points and fine adjustment mechanisms. There was the pumice stone, used for smoothing parchment and erasing errors. Rubbing pumice across parchment would remove a thin layer, taking any ink with it. This had to be done gently, as too much pressure could create a depression in the parchment or wear through it entirely. There were various burnishing tools, used to smooth parchment or to polish gold leaf. These might be made from polished agate, bone, or simply smooth pieces of wood. There were holders for parchment, weights to keep pages from curling, clips to hold multiple pages together. There were containers for storing quills, ink horns with corks or wooden plugs, boxes for keeping finished pages safe from dust and damage. Each scribe accumulated these tools over years of work, some issued by the monastery, some made by the scribe himself, some inherited from scribes who had died or left. A master scribe's set of tools represented a lifetime of refinement, each piece selected or modified for a specific purpose. In the medieval monastery, all work was meant to be a form of prayer. The Benedictine motto was ora et labora, pray and work, with the understanding that work itself was a kind of prayer when done with the right intention. For scribes, this took on a particular significance. They were not just preserving texts, they were preserving the word of God, the writings of the saints, the accumulated wisdom of the church. Each manuscript they completed was an act of devotion, a contribution to the spiritual life of the entire community. Thomas was taught to begin each day's work with a prayer, asking for God's guidance and blessing. He would pray that his hand would be steady, his eye sharp, his mind focused. He would pray that any errors he made would be minor and easily corrected. He would pray that the manuscript he was creating would serve its purpose and bring glory to God. During the work itself, Thomas would try to maintain a prayerful mindset. As he copied the Psalms, he would meditate on their meaning. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." What did it mean to have God as a shepherd? What was the green pasture, the still water? As his hand formed the letters, his mind would explore the theology. When he copied saints' lives, he would reflect on the virtues demonstrated. St. Anthony's patience in the desert, St. Benedict's wisdom in creating his rule, St. Francis's poverty and love of creation. The act of copying became a way of internalizing these examples, of learning from them not just intellectually, but through the physical act of writing about them. Some scribes went further, adding their own prayers into the manuscripts they created. At the end of a particularly difficult text, a scribe might write, "Here ends the book, thank God," or "The scribe's hand is weary, but the work is complete," or "Pray for the scribe who wrote this, that his sins may be forgiven." These personal notes, called colophons, gave a glimpse of the human being behind the careful script. Thomas had not yet dared to add such notes to his own work. He felt he hadn't earned the right. Perhaps when he was older, when he had completed truly significant manuscripts, he might allow himself a brief colophon. For now, his prayer was in the work itself, in the careful formation of each letter. The temptation of pride. One of the spiritual dangers of scribal work was pride. As Thomas's skill improved, as he began to produce pages that were genuinely beautiful, he found himself feeling satisfaction in his work. This was natural and even good. A craftsman should take pleasure in work well done. But it could easily tip over into sinful pride. He would catch himself admiring a particularly well-executed page, thinking about how Brother Ambrose would surely notice the quality, imagining the approval he would receive. Or he would compare his work to that of Martin, the other junior scribe, and feel a sense of superiority when his own pages looked better. This was recognized as a spiritual danger, and the monks were warned against it. Humility was a cardinal virtue. All talent came from God, and to take personal credit for it was to steal glory that belonged to the Creator. The proper attitude was gratitude. Thanks to God for the ability to do this work, combined with awareness of one's own limitations and constant areas for improvement. Brother William, who had every right to pride in his exceptional skill, exemplified this humility. When someone praised his work, he would deflect the praise, saying something like, "It is adequate by God's grace." When a younger scribe asked how he achieved such precision, he would say, "Through long practice and many errors, we are all imperfect instruments." Thomas tried to emulate this attitude, with mixed success. The truth was that he did take pride in his work, and while he knew this was wrong, he couldn't quite suppress the feeling. The best he could do was to confess it regularly, to consciously offer his work to God, rather than seeking human approval, and to remember that no matter how skilled he became, he was still capable of making mistakes. The significance of preservation. Part of what gave meaning to the scribal work was the awareness of its importance for preservation. Books were fragile. Parchment could be damaged by water, eaten by insects, torn or burned. Without constant copying, texts would be lost. The scribes were very aware of this. They knew that the books in their library represented knowledge that had survived from the ancient world, from the church fathers, from more recent scholars and saints. This knowledge had been preserved because someone, somewhere, had taken the time to copy it. And now Thomas and his fellow scribes were links in that chain of preservation. The Psalter he was copying might last 100 years, perhaps 200 if it was well cared for. By then, it would be wearing out, and someone else would need to copy it again. That future scribe, whom Thomas would never meet, who might not even be born yet, was depending on Thomas to do his work well. This created a sense of connection across time. Thomas was copying from an exemplar that had been copied from another manuscript, which had been copied from another, going back perhaps to the time of St. Jerome himself. And the manuscript Thomas created might be copied and copied again, down through the centuries, preserving this text for generations yet to come. There was something profound about being part of this chain. Thomas was a small link, perhaps not a particularly important one, but he was necessary. If he failed to do his work, a gap would appear in the chain. Some text might be lost, some knowledge might disappear from the world. This gave even the most tedious copying task a sense of significance. He wasn't just reproducing words on parchment, he was fighting against the forces of decay and forgetting. He was ensuring that the wisdom of the past would be available to the future. Suffering as sanctification. The physical discomfort of scribal work. The aching back, the cramping hand, the eye strain, the cold in winter and heat in summer, was understood in spiritual terms as a form of mortification. The body suffered, and this suffering could be offered to God as a form of penance and purification. The monks were taught that suffering patiently endured brought one closer to Christ, who had suffered on the cross. The pains of daily life, including the pains of one's work, could be united to Christ's suffering and thereby given redemptive meaning. Thomas tried to embrace this understanding, with varying degrees of success. When his hand cramped after hours of writing, he would think, "This is my cross. I bear it for Christ." When his eyes watered from the strain, he would pray, "Lord, accept this small suffering as a token of my devotion." But there were also times when the suffering seemed simply pointless, when the spiritual interpretation felt forced. His back hurt because he was sitting in an awkward position. His hand cramped because he was gripping the quill too tightly. These were just physical problems with physical causes. To dress them up in spiritual language sometimes seemed like an attempt to make tedious work feel more meaningful than it actually was. Still, the framework was there, and it did provide some comfort. On days when the work seemed unbearable, when every letter was a struggle, Thomas could at least tell himself that this struggle had purpose beyond the immediate task. He was being refined by difficulty, purified by pain, brought closer to God through the very act of enduring. Becoming a journeyman. Thomas's first Psalter was completed after 4 months of work. It was checked by Brother Ambrose, who found a dozen minor errors but deemed the work acceptable overall. The manuscript was bound in brown leather and added to the collection of service books used in the church. Over the following years, Thomas copied many more manuscripts, psalters, gospel books, commentaries, saints' lives. His speed increased as his skill developed. What had taken him 4 months now took 6 weeks. His letters became more uniform, his spacing more precise. The number of errors decreased. When he was 19, Brother Ambrose quietly moved him from his corner desk to one closer to the center windows. This was recognition that he had progressed beyond beginner status. He was now a journeyman scribe, capable of being trusted with more significant work. The promotion came with new responsibilities. He was occasionally asked to check the work of newer junior scribes, to help them with technical problems, to demonstrate proper technique. This felt strange at first. He still thought of himself as learning, and here he was being asked to teach. But he gradually grew into the role, finding that explaining things to others actually deepened his own understanding. The Great Project. When Thomas was 23, Brother Ambrose assigned him to work on what was called the Great Project, a complete Bible that would be the monastery's definitive copy, to be used for reference and study, not for daily liturgical use. This was a massive undertaking. The Bible would be copied in a large, clear script, with wide margins for adding notes and commentaries. It would be bound in multiple volumes. The Pentateuch, the historical books, the wisdom literature, the prophets, the Gospels, the epistles, and Revelation. The entire project would take 5 years and involve 4 scribes working in rotation. Thomas was assigned to work on the historical books: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. This was seen as a moderate assignment, not as prestigious as the Gospels but more significant than some of the minor prophets. He worked on this text for nearly a year, producing pages at a steady rate. The work was exacting. Every word had to match the exemplar exactly. The layout had to be consistent across all the volumes, so measurements were checked constantly. The script had to be readable but also efficient, making good use of the expensive parchment. The Great Project gave Thomas a different perspective on his work. Previously, each manuscript had been a separate task, complete in itself. But now he was part of something larger, a single vision that would take years to realize. His portion of the work would be bound together with the work of other scribes, creating something greater than any of them could produce alone. It also taught him patience on a new scale. A year of work would produce just one section of the Bible. The complete project would outlast his involvement with it. He would finish his portion and move on to other tasks, while others continued the work. He might never even see the completed Bible, if it took longer than expected or if he was assigned elsewhere. Physical decline. By the time Thomas was 30, he had been a scribe for 13 years. The work had left its mark on his body. His right hand had developed a permanent callus on the side of his middle finger, where the quill rested. The joint of his thumb ached in cold weather. His fingers would sometimes cramp without warning, the muscles seizing so tightly that he had to pry his hand open with the other hand and massage the cramped fingers until they relaxed. His back had developed a permanent curve from years of sitting hunched over his desk. He tried to sit straight, but after an hour or two of work, he would inevitably slump forward, his spine curved, his shoulders rounded. This posture had become his default even when he wasn't working. He walked with a slight stoop, his head jutted forward, his gaze naturally angled downward. His eyes were perhaps the most concerning. He had begun to notice that he needed to hold texts farther from his face to read them clearly. The small script that he had once copied with ease now required him to squint and strain. Brother Ambrose, noticing this, began to assign him texts with larger letters, a tacit acknowledgement that Thomas's eyes were failing. This was the trajectory of a scribe's life. The work that required the most acute vision and the steadiest hand was done by the young. As they aged, they would be gradually moved to less demanding tasks, then eventually to work that didn't require fine vision at all. Some scribes ended their careers as librarians or teachers. Others moved to administrative roles. A few, like Brother William, managed to maintain their skill into their 60s, but these were exceptional. Thomas understood that he had perhaps 20 more years of productive scribal work ahead of him, maybe less. Then would come the slow decline, the gradual admission that his eyes were no longer sharp enough, his hand no longer steady enough. He tried not to think about this too much. Better to focus on the work at hand, to produce the best manuscripts he could while he still could. Moments of beauty. Despite the physical toll and the repetitive nature of the work, there were moments when Thomas experienced something close to joy in his scribing. Sometimes, it was simply the satisfaction of completing a particularly difficult page without errors. The text would flow from his quill exactly as it should, every letter perfect, every space correct, the ink drying evenly without blots or smears. He would lean back and look at the page, and there would be a moment of pure achievement. Sometimes it was the content itself. He might be copying a passage from Augustine that suddenly struck him with new understanding, a theological insight he hadn't grasped before, even though he had read the same passage many times. The act of copying, of forming each word slowly and deliberately, would illuminate the meaning in a way that rapid reading never could. Sometimes it was the aesthetic pleasure of the work. A page of text, properly executed, had a beauty to it. The regular rhythm of the letters, the balance of text and margin, the way the lines of script created an almost musical pattern on the page. It was visual harmony, proportion and order made visible. Sometimes it was the sense of connection. He might be copying a gospel passage about Christ's compassion for the suffering, and he would think about all the other scribes across all the centuries who had copied this same passage. They were all part of a great chain, linked by this shared task of preserving and transmitting the Word of God. These moments didn't come often. Most days were just work. Tedious, tiring work that had to be done regardless of how he felt about it. But the moments came often enough to sustain him, to remind him why he had dedicated his life to this craft. News from beyond. The monastery was not entirely isolated from the world. Visitors came, pilgrims, nobles, merchants, messengers from other monasteries or from the bishop. These visitors brought news, and while the monks were not supposed to concern themselves overly with worldly affairs, news had a way of filtering through. Thomas heard about wars, though they seemed distant and abstract. There was always some conflict somewhere, between kings, between kingdoms, between the king and his nobles. These wars might affect the monastery indirectly. Taxes might increase, roads might become unsafe, trade might be disrupted, but the violence itself was far away. He heard about plagues and famines. These were more concerning, as they could affect the monastery directly. A plague in a nearby town might mean fewer pilgrims, less income, more requests for the monastery's help. A famine might mean that the monastery's own fields produced less, that the stores of grain ran low, that meals became even more meagre than usual. He heard about changes in the church. A new pope elected, a council called, some theological dispute that required resolution. These matters seemed important to those discussing them, though Thomas wasn't always sure why. The abbot would sometimes make announcements about such things at chapter meetings, explaining what the monks needed to know, how it might affect their lives. Sometimes the news was more personal. A noble family in the region had died out, their lands reverting to the king. A local monastery had burned, the library lost. A famous scholar had completed a new work that everyone was discussing. These pieces of news created ripples in the quiet pool of monastic life, generating brief conversations during recreation periods, then fading back into routine. The changing nature of books. Over Thomas's years in the scriptorium, he noticed gradual changes in the books being produced. The scripts were changing. The old Carolingian minuscule, with its round, clear letters, was being supplemented, and sometimes replaced by Gothic scripts, which were more angular and compressed. These Gothic scripts allowed more text to fit on a page, saving parchment, but they were also harder to read and more tiring to write. The layout was changing. Older manuscripts had simple one-column layouts. Newer ones often had two columns, with complex systems of marginal notes and references. Some books had multiple texts on the same page. The main text in the center, a commentary surrounding it, notes in the margins. This created visually complex pages that required careful planning. The decoration was changing. In Thomas's early years, most manuscripts had simple decorated initials, perhaps some color but no gold. By the time he was 30, there was increasing demand for more elaborate decoration. Gold leaf was being used more frequently, creating letters that caught the light and shone. Miniature illustrations were being added, tiny detailed paintings showing biblical scenes or the author of the text. This last development didn't affect Thomas directly, as he wasn't trained as an illuminator, but it changed the workflow of the scriptorium. He might copy the text of a gospel book, leaving spaces for decorated initials. Then the manuscript would be passed to Brother Luke, who specialized in illumination. Brother Luke might work on it for weeks, adding colors and gold, before it was considered complete. The threat of change. There were whispers, though Thomas didn't hear them directly, of changes that might affect scribal work more fundamentally. Some said that books were being made differently in other places, that there were workshops in cities where professional scribes worked not for God but for money, copying texts for anyone who could pay. These commercial scriptoria could supposedly produce books faster and in greater quantities than monastery scriptoriums. Others spoke of new ideas about organizing knowledge, creating reference works with alphabetical indices and cross-references that made information easier to find. This would require new skills, new ways of thinking about how books should be structured. There were even rumors, though these seemed fantastical, of experiments with carving letters in relief and using these carved letters to print multiple copies of a page. This seemed impossible. How could carved letters reproduce the subtle variations of handwritten script? How could they handle abbreviations and ligatures? It was likely just a story, the kind of impractical scheme that scholars sometimes proposed, but that would never actually work. Thomas, focused on his daily work, didn't think much about these rumors. The way he had been taught to copy manuscripts was the way it had been done for centuries. It was proven, reliable, effective. Whatever changes might be happening elsewhere, they seemed unlikely to affect his life in any significant way. The meaning of a life's work. Thomas was 35 when he first allowed himself to think seriously about what his life had amounted to. He had been a scribe for 18 years. He had copied. He had never kept careful count. But he estimated, perhaps 40 complete manuscripts. Some were small, simple psalters or prayer books. Others were substantial works, complete gospels, lengthy theological treatises, the historical books of the Bible. Altogether, these manuscripts represented thousands of pages, hundreds of thousands of words, millions of individual letters. What did it all mean? In one sense, the answer was clear. He had preserved knowledge. He had created books that would be used for worship, study, prayer. He had contributed to the intellectual and spiritual life of the monastery, and perhaps beyond. This was valuable work, necessary work, work that served God and humanity. But in another sense, he couldn't help wondering if his contribution was significant or merely dutiful. The books he copied were copies of books that already existed. He hadn't created any new knowledge, hadn't added anything original. He was just a link in a chain, doing what countless scribes before him had done, and what countless scribes after him would do. There was humility in this realization, but also a kind of melancholy. His life's work, when viewed from a certain angle, was just repetition. The same letters, the same words, the same texts, over and over. He had become very skilled at this repetition, but it was repetition nonetheless. He thought about Brother William, now in his 50s, still working at the desk next to his. Brother William had been copying manuscripts for nearly 40 years. Surely Brother William must have grappled with these same questions. Yet he continued to work, day after day, apparently at peace with his life's labour. Perhaps that was the answer. Not to seek some grand significance, but simply to do the work well, to find meaning in the craft itself, rather than in any larger impact. The unexpected beauty of routine. Gradually, Thomas came to appreciate something he hadn't fully understood in his younger years. The beauty of routine itself. The monastic life was built on routine. The same prayers at the same hours, the same meals in the same places, the same work following the same patterns. This could seem stifling, a denial of freedom and spontaneity, but it could also be liberating. When every day followed the same structure, when every task was part of a familiar pattern, the mind was freed from constant decision-making. Thomas didn't have to wonder what he should do next. The routine told him. He didn't have to motivate himself to work. The routine carried him along. He could simply flow with the rhythm of the day, the week, the year. The work itself became a kind of meditation. The familiar motions of preparing ink, cutting quills, forming letters. These required attention but not constant conscious thought. His hands knew what to do. His body had learned the movements. He could work while his mind was quiet, or while it turned over theological questions, or while it simply rested in the present moment. There was peace in this, not the peace of excitement or novelty, but the deeper peace of acceptance and settledness. This was his life. This was what he did. He no longer needed to question whether he should be doing something else or wish he were somewhere different. This was enough. Gratitude. As Thomas entered middle age, he found himself feeling grateful for his life as a scribe despite its difficulties. He was grateful that he had been given the opportunity to learn to read and write, skills that most people in the world would never have. He could access the wisdom of the ages, could read the words of saints and scholars, could understand the scriptures in ways that illiterate peasants could not. He was grateful for the community of the scriptorium. The silence that had once seemed oppressive now felt companionable. He understood his fellow scribes in deep ways that didn't require words. They shared a common purpose, a common struggle, a common achievement. He was grateful for the work itself, tedious as it often was. It had given structure to his life, had taught him patience and precision, had connected him to something larger than himself. He might be just one scribe among thousands, but he was part of a great endeavour, the preservation and transmission of knowledge. He was even grateful, in a strange way, for the physical suffering of the work. It had taught him the limits of his body, had made him aware of his mortality, had given him small daily opportunities to practice patience and endurance. His aching back, his cramping hand, his failing eyes. These were not just problems to be endured, but teachers of sorts, reminding him that he was human, finite, dependent on God's sustaining grace. As the years continued to unfold, Thomas remained at his desk in the scriptorium. The light would shift with the seasons and the hours. The pages would accumulate, one after another. The manuscripts would be completed and bound and shelved. The routine would continue. His hand would move across the parchment, the quill scratching softly, the letters forming in their familiar patterns. Dominus illuminatio mea. Domine, Dominus noster. In principio creavit Deus. The same words that countless scribes before him had written, that countless scribes after him would write. Outside the walls of the monastery, the world would continue its changes. Kingdoms would rise and fall, ideas would develop and spread, technologies would advance. But in the scriptorium, time moved differently. It moved at the pace of a quill crossing parchment, at the rhythm of prayers marking the hours, at the slow accumulation of manuscripts in the library. And Thomas, now neither young nor old, neither novice nor master, would continue his work. Not because it was exciting, or because it brought him fame, or because it promised any reward beyond the work itself, but because this was what scribes did. This was the life he had been given. This was how he served. The light would fade as afternoon moved toward evening. The bell for vespers would ring. Thomas would carefully mark his place, clean his quill, seal his ink. He would stand, his back protesting, and join the line of monks filing out of the scriptorium toward the church. Tomorrow he would return. The desk would be waiting, the parchment ready, the exemplar open to the next page, and he would begin again, as he had begun so many thousands of times before. One letter, then another, building words, building lines, building pages, building books, building a life. May you rest well, knowing that while some built with stone, and others with words spoken aloud, the scribes built with patience and silence, creating monuments of knowledge that would outlast them all. This has been a journey into the quiet world of the medieval scriptorium, where time moved slowly, and life was measured in pages, copied, and manuscripts completed. Thank you for spending this time in the company of scribes. May your own rest be peaceful and deep.